The annals of World War II are filled with stories of immense sacrifice and staggering losses, where victory was often measured in yards and purchased with blood. Yet, amidst this brutal tapestry, one narrative stands in stark, almost unbelievable contrast. The story of the 106th Infantry Division. Arriving in Europe in late 1944, these young men, nicknamed the Golden Lions, were green troops thrust into a quiet sector of the Ardennes forest. Their early days were marked by the tedious routines of a static front, a deceptive calm that the greatest German offensive in the West would soon shatter. Unbeknownst to them, their path was not to be one of mere survival, but of an astonishing, record-shattering achievement. This is the account of how a division, seemingly destined for tragedy, executed a military feat so statistically improbable it defies conventional understanding of war, capturing nearly 90,000 enemy soldiers while losing but a single man to captivity. The stage for this extraordinary event was not set in 1944, but in the bitter winter of 1945, as the Third Reich entered its death throes. Following the brutal ordeal of the Battle of the Bulge, where the 106th had suffered heavily in its initial days, the reconstituted division was assigned to the Allied push into the heart of Germany. Their role was part of the larger Ruhr Pocket operation, a massive encirclement aimed at trapping the entire German Army Group B. As the noose tightened, chaos reigned within German lines, with disorganized units, desperate conscripts, and hardened veterans mingling in a frantic retreat. The 106th found itself advancing against a foe that was at once dangerous and disintegrating, a paradox that demanded both relentless pressure and shrewd psychological tactics to exploit fully. Commanding this unique moment was Major General Donald A. Stroh, a leader who understood that sheer firepower alone would not suffice. His strategy emphasized aggressive, rapid movements to bypass points of stiff resistance, instead focusing on deep penetrations that disrupted German command and control. The division's infantry regiments, the 422nd, 423rd, and 424th, advanced not as a blunt instrument, but as a deft scalpel, slicing through the crumbling German defenses. They utilized reconnaissance troops to probe weaknesses, and engineers worked tirelessly to clear roads and bridges, maintaining a momentum that the disorganized enemy could never hope to match. This operational tempo was key. It created a pervasive sense of inevitability among the German ranks, a belief that further resistance was not just futile, but fatal. The psychological landscape was as crucial as the physical one. The German soldiers trapped in the Ruhr Pocket faced a dire choice: fight to the end for a collapsing regime, or surrender to an enemy whose treatment was an unknown quantity. The 106th, through both deliberate policy and the demeanor of its individual soldiers, worked to make the latter option seem not only safe but sensible. Loudspeaker announcements, orchestrated by psychological warfare teams, broadcast promises of humane treatment, hot food, and an end to the misery. More powerful, however, were the actions of the frontline GIs themselves, who, upon accepting surrenders, often share rations and cigarettes, visually demonstrating the mercy their commanders promised. The sheer scale of the surrender began as a trickle in early April 1945. Isolated squads and platoons, weary and out of supplies, would emerge from woods or battered villages with white flags held high. As the 106th's advance continued unabated, these trickles swelled into streams. Whole companies, then battalions, began to capitulate, their officers recognizing the hopelessness of their situation. The division's logistical units performed Herculean feats, processing thousands of prisoners daily, disarming them, cataloging them, and moving them to the rear in an endless column. The sight of these long, gray lines of dejected men became a daily phenomenon, a visual testament to the complete collapse of the Wehrmacht in the West. One remarkable event epitomized this cascade of surrender. On April 14, 1945, the 424th Infantry Regiment approached the town of Attendorn. Intelligence suggested a potential strong point, but instead of a battle, they were met by a delegation of German officers seeking terms. What unfolded was not a tactical negotiation, but the orchestrated capitulation of an entire corps. For hours, organized formations of German troops marched into designated assembly areas, stacking their weapons in neat piles. The GIs of the 106th, initially wary of trick, stood guard in awe as over 15,000 enemy soldiers peacefully gave themselves up in a single, staggering transaction. The mechanics of handling such an immense volume of prisoners were a monumental task unto itself. Military police platoons, reinforced by clerks, cooks, and drivers, transformed fields into temporary prisoner of war enclosures. The priority was swift processing to maintain the division's combat momentum. German officers were separated from enlisted men. Weapons, uniforms, and personal documents were systematically collected. Perhaps most critically, the 106th adhered strictly to the Geneva Conventions, a fact that spread rapidly through the German ranks via word of mouth, further encouraging surrender. This humane efficiency became a self-perpetuating cycle, easing fears and legitimizing the act of capitulation. Amidst this historic victory, a single, poignant loss underscored the brutal randomness of war. Private First Carl R. May, a rifleman in the 424th Infantry Regiment, was separated from his unit during a night movement on April 13, 1945. In the confused and fluid landscape of collapsing front, he stumbled into a group of German soldiers who, isolated and unaware of the mass surrenders happening elsewhere, took him captive. He was held for a brief, tense 36 hours before his captors, realizing the war was truly over for them, released him to return to American lines. Thus, the 106th Infantry Division's tally of prisoners lost stood at one, a solitary man who experienced a fleeting, terrifying glimpse of the captivity that awaited tens of thousands of his foes. The contrast between PFC May's brief ordeal and the fate of the German prisoners is stark. The men of the 106th, many of whom had seen friends fall in a bulge, exhibited a profound and disciplined professionalism. There were no recorded incidents of maltreatment. The division's focus remained on mission accomplishment and order. This discipline was a credit to their training and leadership. While the Germans faced a profound humiliation of defeat, they did not face brutality. Their captors were weary young Americans who, more than anything, saw in the endless columns of prisoners a sure sign that they might soon be going home themselves. By the time the Ruhr Pocket was fully reduced and the guns fell silent on April 18, 1945, the 106th Infantry Division had accounted for an almost incomprehensible number of prisoners, 90,081 German military personnel. This figure included generals, elite paratroopers, teenage conscripts, and everything in between. They had captured more than 3 times their own strength. In the same period, their total casualties were remarkably light, and their lone prisoner loss, PFC May, had already returned. The statistical anomaly was breathtaking. In the brutal economy of war, where exchanges are often bloody, the 106 had achieved a ratio so lopsided it resembled not combat, but the peaceful dissolution of an army. The division's achievement was not merely a product of circumstance, though timing and location were undeniably favorable. It was a result of a deliberate and expertly executed application of military pressure at the precise moment of the enemy's psychological breaking point. The 106 moved with confidence and speed that offered the Germans no chance to regroup or establish a coherent defense. Their tactics created a perpetual state of crisis behind enemy lines, severing communications and spreading panic. The German command structure, already reeling from relentless Allied assaults on all fronts, simply ceased to function effectively in the sector the 106th operated within. Analyzing the German perspective reveals an army in its death throes. Supplies of fuel, ammunition, and food had utterly collapsed. Morale, particularly among the conscripted Volkssturm and weary infantry, was non-existent. The relentless Allied aerial dominance made any daytime movement suicidal. For the average German soldier in the Ruhr, the choice had become existential: die for a lost cause or live. The reputation of the Americans as fair combatants, amplified by the 106th's own behavior, made a decision increasingly simple. Surrender became not an act of treason, but a rational, even inevitable, step toward personal survival. The role of leadership within the 106th cannot be overstated. From General Strode down to company commanders and non-commissioned officers, there was a unified understanding of the mission's unique nature. Orders emphasized exploitation and encirclement over costly frontal assaults. Initiative was encouraged at the lowest levels. Squad leaders and platoon sergeants often found themselves accepting the surrender of hundreds of enemy troops, making split-second decisions that required both courage and cool judgment. This decentralized command ethos empowered the men on the ground to capitalize on every opportunity the disintegrating enemy presented. The logistical tail of the division performed miracles. As the infantry advanced dozens of miles a day, supply lines stretched thin, keeping thousands of prisoners fed and watered, even at a minimal level, was a staggering burden added to the usual demands of fueling and arming a combat division. Quartermaster and transportation units worked around the clock, their trucks shuttling both supplies forward and prisoners rearward in a constant, exhausting cycle. This unsung effort was the backbone of the operation. Without it, the advance would have stalled and the momentum might have been lost. The impact on the men of the 106th was profoundly complex. For veterans of the Bulge, where they had been cut off and mauled, the rapid advance and mass surrenders provided a form of psychological vindication. The war had transformed from a desperate struggle for survival into a triumphant procession. Yet, the surreal nature of it all was not lost on them. Letters home spoke of the bizarre experience of being outnumbered by their own captives, of the eerie quiet of battlefields replaced by the murmuring of tens of thousands of prisoners. It was a victory, but one that felt disconnected from the brutal combat they had been trained for. In the immediate aftermath of the German surrender in May 1945, the story of the 106th began to attract attention within military circles. The numbers were so extraordinary that they required verification from higher headquarters. After thorough review, the figures stood as fact. The division had set a record that would never be equaled in the European theater. Their campaign became a textbook study in the culmination of offensive operations, demonstrating how relentless pressure, when applied to a morally and physically shattered enemy, could achieve decisive results with minimal bloodshed. It was a potent lesson for future military strategists. The single prisoner lost, PFC Karl May, returned to his unit a minor celebrity, though his experience was one of profound relief rather than glory. His brief captivity served as a poignant reminder of the fine line between triumph and misfortune in war. Had he been captured a week earlier, or in a different sector, his fate could have been drastically different. His safe return completed the division's remarkable statistical picture, allowing the 106th to truly claim it had almost unilaterally decided the terms of human loss in their sector, turning the traditional dynamics of captivity entirely on their head. The 90,000 German prisoners entered a post-war system unprepared for such volume. For the 106th, the task was merely to process and hand them over to rear echelon authorities. These men would eventually become part of the vast population of disarmed enemy forces, facing years of reconstruction labor and an uncertain future. Their capture by the 106th, however, likely saved countless lives on both sides. It prevented a futile, last-ditch stand that would have devastated German towns and extracted a final, bloody price from American divisions eager to see the war's end. Historians would later contextualize the 106th's feat as the perfect storm of late-war conditions. The division was the right instrument, in the right place, at the absolute right time. They were a sharp, motivated force hitting the enemy at the precise moment of systemic failure. While other units fought fiercer battles for more prestigious objectives, no other Allied formation could claim such an efficient, wholesale removal of enemy combatants from the field. It was warfare at its most clinical and effective, a masterclass in leveraging total operational advantage. For the Golden Lions, the victory was bittersweet. Their early trauma in the Bulge, where they suffered over 8,000 casualties in their first 3 days, was now overshadowed by this unprecedented success. The division's legacy became a tale of two extremes, among the war's hardest-hit units in one battle, and its most captor-effective in another. This duality made their story uniquely compelling, a narrative of resilience and redemption that showcased the chaotic, unpredictable arc of a soldier's experience in a world war. The lessons embedded in this story transcend World War II. It demonstrates the immense value of psychological operations integrated with swift maneuver. It highlights how the moral component of warfare, the will to fight, can evaporate faster than material strength, and how a discerning commander can exploit that collapse. The 106th's campaign proved that the ultimate objective of military action is not necessarily the annihilation of the enemy, but the imposition of one's will upon them, a goal achieved here not through destruction, but through an overwhelming demonstration of inevitable defeat. In popular memory, the 106th's story is less known than the dramas of D-Day or the Bulge, but within military historiography, it remains a landmark. The statistics alone ensure its place, a 90-0-0-0 to 1 prisoner ratio. It stands as a testament to the fact that in war, numbers and outcomes can defy all expectations and logic. The division's soldiers, many of whom were replacements themselves after the Ardennes, walked away from the conflict knowing they had participated in something statistically miraculous, a closing chapter of the European War that favored astonishing gain over tragic loss. The equipment and tactics used were standard for a late war U.S. Infantry Division, yet their application was masterful. The ubiquitous M1 rifle, the Browning automatic rifle, Sherman tanks in support, and relentless artillery observation. All were employed not to pulverize, but to persuade. Tactical movements were designed to showcase American strength and German vulnerability. A key tactic was the use of limited, precise attacks to demonstrate resolve, followed by immediate opportunity for surrender, a 1-2 punch that broke unit cohesion permanently. The German commanders trapped in the pocket, notably Field Marshal Walter Model of Army Group B, eventually chose suicide over surrender. But for the rank and file, the decision was made for them by the relentless advance of units like the 106. Model's loss of control was the 106th's opportunity. By cutting communication lines and overrunning command posts, the American infantry created a vacuum of authority, leaving isolated German units to make their own fateful choices, which overwhelmingly trended toward capitulation. The post-war lives of the 106th's veterans were shaped by this extraordinary finale. At reunions, the tales of accepting the surrender of entire regiments with a single squad were recounted with enduring amazement. They carried the pride of a job done with supreme efficiency and humanity. Their legacy was not one of romanticized combat, but a swift, decisive, and merciful end to the fighting in their sector, a conclusion that surely allowed many of them, and many of their former enemies, to build peaceful lives after cataclysm. Examining the broader campaign map of April 1945, the 106th's sector glows as a hotspot of mass capitulation, while fierce fighting continued elsewhere, especially against fanatical SS units. The area penetrated by the Golden Lions saw the literal disintegration of a modern army. This was not a negotiated peace, but wholesale loss of the will to resist, facilitated by agile and confident American infantry who offered a clear, safe alternative to annihilation. It was, in its way, a profoundly civilized conclusion to years of savage warfare. The story also invites reflection on the nature of captivity and loss in war. For the 106, to lose only one man as a prisoner was to exercise near total control over the battlefield's human toll. It inverted the usual paradigm of capture, where isolated soldiers are swept up by the advancing tide. Here, the tide was entirely American, and it swept up the German army whole. PFC May's experience was the exception that proved the rule, a statistical anomaly within an anomaly, highlighting just how complete the division's dominance had become. In memorials and unit histories, the 106 rightly honors all who served, from the Bulge to the Ruhr. But the final chapter is what sets them apart in the annals of military history. It is a story that combines operational brilliance with profound good fortune, a moment when the fog of war lifted to reveal a clear path to an almost bloodless victory. It underscores a timeless truth, that the greatest military victories are those that achieve strategic objectives while preserving life, a principle the 106th Infantry Division enacted on a scale never seen before or since. The weapons are silent now, the prisoners long released, the veterans pass into history. But the record endures, a permanent entry in the ledgers of World War II. The U.S. 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, suffered a tragic birth in the snows of the Ardennes, but achieved a triumphant and unique legacy in the spring of Germany. They demonstrated that in war, the most formidable weapon can sometimes be the offer of mercy, delivered from a position of unquestioned strength. Theirs is a story not of vengeance, but of overwhelming, conclusive efficiency. Therefore, when the total history of the Second World War is considered, with tens of millions of casualties, and its narratives of despair and heroism. The campaign of the 106 stands as a singular beacon of a different outcome. It is the story of the division that captured an army, that traded bullets for prisoners at a rate that defied imagination, and that marched into history, having secured the freedom of 90,000 men, while losing only one of their own to that same fate. It remains, and likely will forever remain, the most disproportionate and humane victory in modern warfare.